Yo! Welcome to Boxes and Bubbles. Today I want to answer the question I see asked more than any other about comic books. How do I start reading comics? That's a question that I had myself for decades before I finally got on board the comics train. Comic book characters always look so cool and the idea always appealed to me. And though I'd read Watchmen and Sandman and kind of smaller self-contained series, superhero stuff looked impossible to get into. But actually it's much simpler than it seems. I didn't start really reading comics until I was about 30. And I feel like it's such a shame because I really loved them. And if I had just known some things a bit sooner, it would have been way easier for me to get started. So in this video, I hope I can share what I have learned in the past 4 or 5 years of reading comics to help other people find their way in. Because comics is such an awesome and super fun hobby once you find your way in. And that leads us nicely to the number one thing I would say to anybody who wants to start reading comics. Just go for it. If you have the interest and the desire to read comics, that's really all you need. Comics from the big two, that's DC and Marvel, can seem impenetrable. It might feel impossible to find your way in, but actually it's way simpler than you might think. I'll get to those later though. Just before that, there are a couple of things I want to squeeze in. Just like there are so many kinds of movies or restaurants or music, there are so many different kinds of comic books. If you start reading one and you find you're not enjoying it, don't let that put you off all comics for good. Just like you don't let seeing one bad movie put you off all movies, or hearing one bad song doesn't put you off all music, and eating one bad meal doesn't mean you'll never eat again. You've got to find what suits your personal tastes. And what's great is that there are plenty of places that sell digital comics, which offer free issues or free trials, so you don't even need to spend any money to start finding your feet. More on those later. Don't limit yourself to superheroes. There are comics about so many things, and it's surprising how many people just don't know that. There are comics about dogs, comics about pirates, comics about fencing, mystery comics, horror comics, even a comic about a man who wants to have a relationship with a woman who is also a train. Marvel and DC are the biggest publishers out there, and they publish almost exclusively hero comics. But there are plenty of other publishers who put out all kinds of comic books about all kinds of things. Since these companies publish mainly shorter series, and they don't rely on well-established titles, there's so much variety and experimentation in these comics, and they really do cover an infinite number of subjects. You'll get much wilder stories and art styles if you're willing to look beyond fights and tights. But what's most important for our purposes here is this. The series that these publishers put out are generally much shorter than comics from the big two, which have been running for decades. They aren't difficult to catch up on if you want to read one that's currently being released monthly. And usually, a few months after all of the monthly parts are finished being released, it will all get collected and released in one easy to read book. And speaking of easy to read, remember how I said that, despite how it looks, Marvel and DC comics are actually not that hard to get into? It's super easy if you remember that. You don't need to, and shouldn't, read everything. This is the piece of advice that I needed most back in the day, and the one thing that took me the longest to overcome when it comes to Marvel and DC. When we watch a TV show, or a movie, or read a book, we start at the beginning, right? That's the obvious way to do it. How about if a show has 3 seasons? Season 1, Episode 1 seems like the smart choice. Now, it might be hard to hear, but you absolutely do not need to go back and do that for hero comics. Actually, it's the wrong way to go about it for several reasons. But it's a very hard habit to break. It seems counterintuitive. It goes against the way that you've been experiencing storytelling in every other medium. It just feels wrong. Or maybe you're a completionist and you just want to know and read everything. Maybe you're listening to me right now and thinking, yeah, but I still really want to read all of Spider-Man. To read every comic featuring even just one well-known major superhero would be a gargantuan task, horribly expensive, and not only that, it really wouldn't be much fun for you at all. For some history here, the first appearance of Spider-Man was in 1962, Batman in 1939, and Superman in 1938. That means that the youngest of these three, Spidey, has been around for 60 years. 60 years of multiple comics featuring Spider-Man per month. It's a very rare person indeed who's read all of those, and you certainly don't need to either. What's difficult to grasp from the outside is that while officially all of the hero's stories take place within one lifetime and are one narrative, the exact order and sequence of events is not really very important. It isn't really one long story like that. There are tie-ins and crossovers and miniseries too, so it can appear super duper confusing, but it's much simpler than it seems. Have you ever looked up a reading list for a character that you're interested in? There'll be a giant list of comics for you to read, and because they've been ordered for you in sequence, it's easy to figure that you have to start at the beginning and work your way all the way through. You totally don't. All these lists are doing is listing which comics have involved that character and the order in which they were released. It doesn't mean that you can't jump around or cherry pick without being totally confused. While some stories do connect or reference back to each other, it's pretty rare and almost always in passing. There are often multiple comics featuring the same character released in 1 month, and in one book they'll be off on one adventure, and in the other book they're doing something completely different. And it's never clarified for you how in Series A they're here, and in Series B they're way over here, because it's not important. It doesn't matter which of these things happened first, if they happened simultaneously, or if they were months apart, because like I said, there's not really one all-encompassing narrative. So, instead of thinking of long-running comics as one long story with a beginning, a middle, and eventually an end, which is all connected, and that you must read from the beginning, it might be easier to think of them like old myths, legends, or gods. Let's take Greek myths, for example. We know Zeus is the big boss of Olympus. He has some thunder powers, and he's quite a womanizer. He's had many different adventures. And Peter Parker was bitten by a radioactive spider and gained superpowers. He has had several love interests and many adventures. So long as you know the very basic key traits of a character, you're going to be fine jumping in wherever you want to. Just like how Zeus's stories are all self-contained adventures, all of which took place over one lifetime, Spider-Man's stories, though one story may take many issues to tell, are all self-contained events that took place over the course of his life. That's not to say that things never connect, but once one adventure is over, everything will revert to normal so that jumping into the next story is easy. Once you know the bare minimum about a character, all you really need to do is figure out where you want to start, and that's much easier and simpler than you might think too. All you need to do is pick a character that you like and jump in. It really is that simple, and picking a place to start is pretty simple too. My advice would be to first get to know the very basics of the character that you want to read. That can be as simple as googling their name and the word origin or powers. You'll always find a Wikipedia or fan wiki page that will get you the essential stuff in minutes. Again, don't feel like you need to read the entire page. Just their powers and how they got them is generally enough to get you started. Some heroes have had their origins modernized and retold in standalone books too, like the Marvel Season 1 books, and they're a bit more fun to read than a wiki page. After the basic stuff you need to know, find their most recent run and start at the beginning of that. Just in case you don't know what that means, in long-running comics, writers and artists change relatively often. Sometimes, when both the writer and the artist change, there'll be a new #1 issue to make it super clear that the previous story arc is finished and done with, and that the story is going to be taking on a new direction. That's a perfect time for new readers, or readers who weren't enjoying the previous arc to jump in. Other times, the story isn't finished yet, and it will be continuing with a different writer or different artist, and the numbers will continue in sequence. A run, then, is just what we call the issues of a comic made by a particular writer or creative team. So even if it comes in the middle of a story, it's clear whose work and which issues we're talking about. Think of it like chapters in a book. The book itself is the entire comic from the beginning, and the runs are the chapters. When a new writer takes over for a run, the previous chapter has wrapped up. You won't be completely lost if you join the story there. Though there might be some small references to something that you didn't read, and in that case, usually the writer will help you know what you need to through context. And if they don't, you can almost always do a search, find the relevant information in under 2 minutes using those handy wikis I mentioned earlier, and then you can just skip to the relevant section. So a new run just means a fresh #1 with a new creative team, or the most recent time that a writer of a series changed. Let's use Nightwing as an example. I had never read Nightwing before, but a writer I particularly like, Tom Taylor, took over writing it at issue 78, so I decided to check it out. I could read it and follow it just fine, even with no previous knowledge of the character or the storyline. And that's what I'd recommend for any character. It's how I found my jumping on point for countless hero comics over the past 5 years or so. It might feel a bit weird to start at the most recent stuff instead of going way back to the start, but the main reason I'd recommend doing it this way is that specifically hero comics from any time before around 2000 really haven't aged well, in my opinion. I've read the entirety of some well-loved runs from the 90s, and as hard as I tried to force myself to like them, Comics back then were much goofier. Going back even earlier to the 60s and 70s, even more so. And that's not to say at all that they don't have merit, worth and value. It's worth noting that everything that came before influenced and shaped how things are now, but the most recent stuff just feels so much more polished, and there's much more consistency in the writing and tone. If you read and really love a character's more recent stuff, then is a better time to go back into the archives and try out older stuff. So now you've picked what you want to read and where to start from. Now all you need to do is get your hands on the books, right? And there are some easy ways you can start right now for free. Try reading digitally. There are a bunch of different ways you can read comics digitally, and all of them have free issues or free trials. Check the description for the links to all of these. Comixology is my go-to for digital comics. Though, if what you want to read is hero books from Marvel or DC, there are better places which I'll get to in a second. Comixology has a freebies section, and though it's not super big, you can start right away and check out some comics there. You need to either make an account, or since they're owned by Amazon, you can use your Amazon account to log in. Once you claim the free books, you can read them in a browser, or if you have a tablet, you can use their app to download them and read them offline. They also offer a service called Comixology Unlimited, which gives you unlimited access to 25,000 digital comics for $6 a month. There's a free trial too, so you can start today without spending any money. Comixology Unlimited doesn't include the latest releases though, so if you want to read something that came out just this month, you have to pay extra for that. Marvel has their own service and app too, called Marvel Unlimited. It works similarly. There's a free section, a monthly subscription for $9.99, an annual option for $69.99, or $99.99 for Marvel Unlimited Plus. Again, there's also a free trial so you can check it out without paying anything. A subscription will give you unlimited access to 29,000 digital comics, but unlike Comixology, every single one of those are from Marvel, and they've all been digitized and cleaned up. They look amazing. I can't imagine how much work went into that. New comics from Marvel are added from 3 to 6 months after they're released, meaning that your subscription won't keep you right up to date, but you won't be far behind. If you want to be caught up and read things as soon as they're released, there's also the option to buy each issue on its release day. Again, you can read through your browser, or you can use their dedicated app, which lets you download books to read offline. And if you want some DC, they also have a similar offering called DC Universe Infinite, though it's only available in the US, so I haven't personally been able to use this one. Again, there's a free to read section, a free trial, and a subscription, which this time costs $7.99 a month. But this time, it includes over 24,000 comics, again all from DC. And again, new comics are added 6 months after their initial release, so a subscription won't have you reading the very, very latest stuff. There's also a system in the US called Hoopla, which allows you to use your library card to borrow digital files, including comic books, for a limited time. Again, I'm not from the US, so I have no idea how this one works, but it sounds just like going to the library, but with digital files, which is a cool idea. And of course, you could just try using the regular library in your town and seeing what they have. Those are all the ways I know of which will let you read comics easily, cheaply, and for free, starting now. But of course, if you want to buy physical books, buying physical comics. If you're lucky enough to live in a place with a local comic book store, that's the best place to go and get yourself started. Books there might be a tiny bit more expensive than they would from some online retailers, but smaller local businesses need support if they're going to survive when the market is dominated by giant mega companies. Comic stores can also set up a subscription for you, where you can tell them which series you want to read, and they can make sure that they'll always keep a copy aside for you. Or they can order a copy of a collected edition if you ask them. Remember that with physical comics, each issue will get its own release, but eventually a book collecting a number of issues will come out. It's up to you which way you want to buy them, but generally for older things, finding a book is much faster, cheaper, and easier than hunting down each individual issue. For newer things, you can either buy each issue, or wait a bit and pick up the book, or do both. If, like me, you don't live in a place with a comic store, Amazon is an easy go-to, but check out bookshops from your country, or try bookdepository.com, who sometimes have some nice sales and also offer free international shipping, which is super useful if you live in somewhere that's a bit unusual, but want to buy books in English. Have fun! If you're reading a comic book and you're not having a good time, maybe you're not really enjoying it, then maybe change to another book. Finding your way in is all about finding which stuff you like, and trying to brute force your way through a comic because someone told you it's good, or because you are a completionist and want the entire story is such a waste of time. There are thousands upon thousands of comics out there. There's really no good reason to stick with something you're not enjoying. Just remember what I mentioned before. Don't let reading one book you don't like scare you off right away. Try other things until you find something that you really enjoy. If you want to read comics, then it's just a case of building your own set of tastes and preferences. And one last thing, elevate. Don't tear down. As you might have worked out by now, I love comics as a hobby. The medium is super collaborative, and if you follow creators on any social media, you'll quickly see how happy they are to be working with each other. They praise, admire, thank, and congratulate each other. Making comic books is hard. It takes so much work from a big team, and a lot of effort from a lot of people, and it doesn't make those people a lot of money. They do it because they love to do it. So the last thing I'd like to pass on is this. If you love a comic, share it with your friends, send a kind message to those involved in it, review it online and recommend it to others. And if you read one that you didn't like, well, of course you can tell people about it. There's absolutely no need and no excuse for sending unkind or disrespectful messages to the people involved. It's a dreadful waste of time and energy to do that, and it has zero positive result. Nothing good can come from that, right? So maybe just don't do it. That's all. And that's it. I hope passing on what I learned can help some new readers find their way into comics. If you have any questions, please feel free to drop them into the comment section. If I've helped you out, a thumbs up would be awesome. If you see someone online asking how they can get into comics, I'd be delighted if you wanted to share this with them. If you're just now getting into comics, have a look around the rest of my channel for some spoiler-free reviews of recently released titles you can hop into. Throw me a sub if you'd like to help my channel grow, and follow me on Twitter @BoxesNBubbles to find lots of other spoiler-free reviews of the dozens of newly released comic books I read every week. Now get out of here! Go read some comics!